Hello everyone, Inquisitor Vaughn here, and in today's video I would like to, in a very roundabout way, talk about the Krork. In the lore for the Warhammer 40k universe, the Krork are said to be the predecessors of the Ork species that currently exists in the 40k universe. They are said to have been super strong, super big, and super technologically advanced in comparison to the Orks. And recent information has me questioning this. And because I was questioning it, that led to me doing a deep dive, and because I did a deep dive, this led to this video that I'm making now. So let's get into it. In regards to the species that existed millions of years before the emergence of humanity in the 40k universe, almost all of them except for the Necrontyr had a mythology that tied them in some way to the mysterious beings known as the Old Ones. The lore for the Old Ones is pretty vague, but they are said to be the creators of life in the galaxy in the 40k universe. So they were the first beings in existence, and they were the ones who created all other life in the galaxy. The deeper you go into the lore for the Old Ones, you'll find a mention of a species called the Slann, and the lore for the Old Ones and the lore for the Slann overlap at several points in a way that would make you think that they are the same thing. However, the lore itself divides on the matter of their nature. The Old Ones were a peaceful species that contemplated the mysteries of the universe and eventually retired from active participation in the galaxy, settling in the Northern Rim long before ever encountering the Necrontyr or undergoing any conflict whatsoever. The Slann were relatively aggressive in comparison. They expanded throughout the galaxy, were said to have both seeded planets with life and aided in the evolution of several other species. In the lore for the Slann, there is a distinction between the Old Slanni and the Slann, in which it was the Old Slanni who retired from the galaxy and the Slann which evolved from them. It is likely that the Old Slanni are what the Slann called the Old Ones, which implies that the Old Ones created the Slann and that the Slann were the first species to be created by the Old Ones, which came into sentience before all of the other species that were made. So basically, the Old Ones created various species, but in terms of evolution, the Slann came first and they took care of all of the other species and nurtured them and their evolution into sentient species. If we correspond information on the Eldar, which says that the Old Ones created the Eldar, and we compare it to information on the Slann, which says that it was they who seeded worlds with life, who nurtured the evolution of other species, and who warned the Eldar about their future creation of a Chaos God, and we consider that the Old Ones retired from creation before the Eldar even existed, this means that while the Eldar were likely told about their true creators, who were the Old Ones, it wasn't the Old Ones that the Eldar were actually referring to in regards to their interactions with the Old Ones. It was the Slann. It was the Slann who they were referring to as the Old Ones. Because even if the Old Ones created the Eldar before they themselves retired from the galaxy, it was the Slann who evolved into intelligence first, and it was the Slann who tended to the other evolving species in the universe, including the Eldar. But this also means that it wasn't the Old Ones that the Necrons faced in the War in Heaven, but it was the Slann and those species they quote-unquote created, but in reality nurtured. One of these species that they were said to have created was the Orks. Now, according to the Orks, they themselves were created by the Brain Boys, which was their name for the Old Ones. According to available information, the quote-unquote Brain Boys created a warrior race known as the Krork as a last-ditch attempt to defeat the Necrons and the Enslavers. It is commonly believed and regurgitated that the Krork were created first, and from the Krork came the Orks. However, If we look at the lore for the Nekthist dynasty and their pharaoh, Obelisk the Enslaver, we find out that the Orks were a species that were already around before the War in Heaven. It was the Orks that attacked the Nekthist crown world while the dynasty was still flesh and blood Necron tier. The Triarch's refusal to aid the dynasty is what would lead them to become the untrustworthy savages amongst the Necrons. So basically, Orks already existed way before the War in Heaven. If we compare information that the Orks were already around way before biotransference with the information that the Krork were created as a last-ditch attempt to defeat the Necrons and the Enslavers, this would mean that the Orks came first and then the Krorks were made. And see, this is why I question how the War in Heaven is visualized and imagined. The Necrons here, despite what technological advances they made in order to spread throughout the galaxy, were still getting washed up by the other species that already existed. There was technology, but it was not the same kind of technology that existed later on in their history. I received some flack for suggesting that the Necrons here had relatively primitive weapons in comparison to what they have now, which is considered technologically advanced. But what I meant by primitive, I meant, for the most part, unpowered. Technological advancement is subjective and relative. We still look back at civilizations like the Egyptians and the Mayans and the Aztecs and regard their works as being technologically advanced for the time that they were used, even though we have much better technology now. The sword, by itself, is a primitive weapon. However, install it with a power generator and it becomes a power sword, which is considered technologically advanced. The blades that the Necrons here used were only different from the ones they used as Necrons in that the Necron blades were made of a different material and energized by eldritch stellar radiation. Same thing, just upgraded. If we were to apply that principle to all the species that existed at the time, after the Necrons here underwent biotransference, everyone had to be upgraded, otherwise they were all going to be annihilated. Weapons were upgraded and so were the species themselves. Natural Eldar are closer to Exodites, but they became more like the Eldar that we know today because the Necrons came into existence, and their technology advanced because of it as well, including the weaponization of Wraithbone. The Slann in the current lore wear Mesoamerican styled armor that appears to be primitive but is actually invested with a shield generator which protects its wearer in a similar way to a force field made by the Crux Terminatus on a Space Marine Terminator. We look at the close combat weapons of the Slann and don't take them seriously, but think about this. Mesoamerican weapons often incorporated obsidian. Obsidian is a black glassy stone. What is a black glassy stone in Warhammer 40k? Noctilith. Negatively charged Noctilith repels the warp and psychic energy. The Cadian pylons are negatively charged Noctilith. The Ankhs of the Zerekin dynasty are negatively charged Noctilith. However, positively charged Noctilith can weaponize the warp and project psychic energy. Hitting a Necron with a positively charged Noctilith blade is like getting hit with a psychic weapon and likely has the same effect as a Dragon Glass blade on a White Walker. Yeah, that was totally a Game of Thrones reference. I'm sorry if I ruined anything for anyone, but if you watch Game of Thrones, you get the reference. Anyways, the Orks were likely just primitive tribes of Xenos before the War in Heaven, but were physically made into the Krorks in order to fight the Necrons. That gestalt consciousness of the Wa being weaponized into creative potential to create new weapons in order to face the Necrons. The Orks probably clad themselves in bits of armor made from materials they found during their conquests before the War in Heaven. The Orks in the current setting wear bits of debris as armor that are essentially looted from other species like the Imperium. I think it's highly likely that the Krorks clad themselves in looted necrodermis and used Gauss weaponry against the Necrons. This especially since the Krorks are described as being technologically advanced. So it's all about perspective and it's all like relative to context. So perhaps it is true that the modern orcs are the result of the Krorks as a kind of de-evolution of the species after the War in Heaven. But the orcs themselves were created before the Krorks, and I think that is the point that I'm trying to make with this video. The orcs came first, then the Krorks were made, and then the modern orcs were the result after the War in Heaven. They are still technologically advanced, just in a primitive way in comparison to how the Krorks were and how other intelligent species are now in the 40k universe. This has definitely been the case with the Slann, who still exist in the current 40k universe. The modern Slann are a de-evolution of the Slann that existed before and during the War in Heaven, and they wear, like I said earlier, primitive seeming armor, which is actually technologically advanced. It's seeming like the only species that didn't devolve were the Eldar, even though technically, if you really think about it, they did devolve in their own way with the creation of the Dark Eldar or the Drukhari, but just not in the same way as the other species that physically devolved. Or maybe I'm wrong about that. I don't really know much about the Eldar. Maybe I should do a deep dive on that. Many people ask what it would take for Games Workshop to bring back the Krorks. I think a possible answer to that is if they brought back an old one or the Slann. But even then, the Krorks are likely to be an HQ unit as part of the Orcs army rather than a full army by itself, because if they did make a full army of Krork and make them their own faction, then the Orc faction would become pointless. I was inspired to make this video because someone in one of the Facebook groups that I'm a part of, they asked about the Krorks, and they mentioned something about the Krorks being brought back and how they would be brought back, and that's what inspired me to do a little bit of digging on the Krorks. And I guess the takeaway from this video is that the old ones created all of the species that existed before the War in Heaven, right? But it was the Slann that evolved first, and then they nurtured other species into existence. Those species that they nurtured into existence were the Eldar and the Orks, amongst many others. However, after biotransference, after the Necrons underwent biotransference, or the Necron tier underwent biotransference, everyone got upgraded, and so the Orks were made into the Krorks in order to fight against the Necrons. However, the Krorks devolved after the War in Heaven because there was no Necron threat. And so if Games Workshop were to bring it back, or bring the Krorks back as a faction, they would have to bring it back as like an individual character or HQ option, because if they were to bring it back as an entire faction, the Orks as they are now would be pointless. What would be the point of having Orks when you can have Krorks, right? But who knows, maybe Games Workshop will figure out a clever way to bring back the Krorks. I personally think it would be unnecessary, but it would also be welcomed. You know, they did a very good job with linking the Leagues of Votann to the Demiurge and the Squats. They did a really good job tying all that mythology together into resulting in the new faction of the Leagues of Votann. So maybe they can do the same with the Krorks. However, I personally believe that they will be bringing back the Slann in some way or form, because they did have Slann previously in Rogue Trader 40k. They look like frog people, and they might get an update to look more like lizard men, hopefully, if they do. But who knows, you know, we'll see. But without anything else to be said, Inquisitor Vaughn out. Remember, the Emperor protects and the future is successor.